Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Corporate Scrutiny Panel, Kirklees Council. On the agenda today, we have a one-item agenda, but it is a very important item, which is the Council's financial management update. What is a difficult time for local government around the country, and here in Kirklees as well. So first we go to the membership of the committee. Have we had any apologies for absence?
None received, Chair.
Oh, and I must add, we've been joined by members of corporate governance this morning as well. Okay, anything to raise under the minutes of the previous meeting? Going.
They're okay. Yeah.
Gone. Any interests to declare? Nope. Next item, admission of the public. Yes, they're perfectly welcome. Deputations and petitions.
None received, Chair.
Yep, good stuff. Public question time. No public here, so this is going really well, isn't it? Public question time, and so Council financial management update. I'll hand straight over to Eamon Croston.
Good morning, colleagues. I'll just get my background sorted. Apologies. Okay, I think I'm on now. Excellent. Everybody see me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Doing fine.
Okay, thank you. So, thank you, Chair. So, yeah, my name's Eamon Croston. I'm Service Director Finance for Kirklees Council. So I thought I'd just do a bit of scene setting and context for the basis of this particular financial management update report, because it's got particular emphasis on reserves this time. So I want to put just a little bit of context to that, but clearly it still picks up on everything that's sort of buffeting the council at the moment, and we're in the throes of budget development at this time of year as well. So it's a quite timely session to have a review. So yeah, so this is one of a series of regular financial management updates that comes to corporate scrutiny panel through the municipal year. I think it's fair to say that council reserves is something we've reported extensively through budget rounds and also in-year monitoring, and it's also picked up through a corporate governance and audit committee in terms of sort of broader review of council's financial statements and auditor updates, etc. So I think one of the reasons why there's particular focus on reserves this time, I'll say one of the reasons, it's probably timely for a number of reasons, to be honest. Council reserves is an integral feature of all councils' forward strategies and plans, and has been for a number of years in terms of supporting financial resilience, sustainability, developments, etc. So this report in part was why do we need reserves? You know, it's a good refresh, I think, to actually stand back a little bit and understand why councils need reserves as a public sector organisation, and also what is deemed an appropriate level of reserves, because it's certainly not a prescriptive calculation in determining what a council's reserves levels might be at a particular point in time. It's very much a subjective, and from my perspective as a Chief Finance Officer, a professional judgment call, but I appreciate, because there is an element of subjectivity around it, then different commentators and folks will have different views as to what may or may not be appropriate. So, you know, clearly professionally, I would need to understand and justify a level of reserves at a point in time, and as would other colleagues. As I said, we're also heavily into the annual budget process now. So budget proposals, current development. We've got provisional financial settlement, which is what government issues around about this time of the year. That's coming later this week, probably by the 16th of December, that sets out our provisional funding allocations at an individual local authority level for 22-23, and that's going to be hugely significant as well, given some of the headline announcements from the spending review in October. So at the moment, while we're pulling together our budget development proposals, we're making a set of assumptions as to what that means for us at an individual local authority level. So we'll obviously review the numbers when they get issued later this week. And obviously as well, appreciate that we've been going through quite a significant challenge over the last couple of years, it feels like, globally, nationally and locally, regionally, in terms of managing the coronavirus pandemic. But we're just at a situation now where we might have thought we were coming through the worst of the Delta variant, and now we've got a new strain and a new set of national measures, and whether they ratchet up or not. So I think, again, it just reflects some of the short-term volatility and bumps in the road that we're all facing as we're trying to come through from something that has clearly had a significant impact on council's bottom line positions in supporting a raft of community national measures to support the control of infection rates, and that could start to ratchet up again. So it's just a reflection, a good example, a prime example of where there's still that external volatility and how that might impact, and what our reserves might be there to help buffet as well in that context. So yeah, reserves levels nationally, I think it's picked up in the report as well. It's been an unusual year, and at the moment, we haven't got the national figures from the SIT for Resilience Index, which is also included in the report, which is a national benchmarking tool to help local authorities assess their resilience and sustainability based on a number of national performance measures based on publicly available national data sets. So it's comparing councils, like-minded councils across the whole range of activity, including levels of reserves. But what I set out in the report is that actually there has been quite a significant increase in reserves levels between 2021 and 21-22 nationally across different types and categories of council. And that's largely, but not exclusively, because many councils have rolled forward a number of the funding streams they got in 2021 to support COVID into 21-22 because of continuing pressures and impacts in 21-22. And I think certainly for councils like Kirklees, we'll be deploying most of that remaining funding in 21-22. Not all of it, because some of it might be used in 22-23 as well, some of it for technical reasons, but some of it also because of continuing COVID wash through in 22-23. So that's something that's not reflected in the SIT for Resilience Index that I've incorporated into report, which was based on the last available snapshot in terms of looking at things like relative levels of reserves held across like-minded councils, for example, was based on 19-20 outturn information. So as soon as we get the 2021 outturn data, I'll certainly want to circulate it as soon as possible. It is in the public domain, and there is a link to that resilience index, so you can go in anytime, as a member of the public effectively, and just sort of play around with it yourself, really. So it's there as a guide to help us. I mean, there is also been a lot of national interest and continuing national interest, and probably ratcheting up national interest in more generally in the financial resilience and sustainability of an increasing number of councils over recent years, and that's exemplified, I think, in the report that we've also appended from Grant Thornton. That also happens to be our external auditors. Grant Thornton cover about 40% of the market for local authority audits. And they seem to be the ones that have predominantly been issuing a number of public interest reports recently. So they did in March 21 issue a kind of a lessons learned stock take on a number of public interest reports that have been hitting the sector, which I thought was kind of useful reference information as well, because it does include within their analysis consideration of the reserves levels held by some councils, and whether or not it's enough, or whether or not even, the more uncertainty we have, particularly around external factors, but not exclusively, then the more the need to actually for councils to build up what would be termed whatever an adequate level of reserves is. And they gave some guidelines, which I thought was interesting, even though it's not prescriptive, so we can pick that up as well. And there is a lot of commonality in terms of the types of risks that councils like us, as a relatively large Met with statutory responsibilities for education and social services, might hold. So when we look at comparable risk registers, corporate risk registers in other authorities like ours, I would expect there to be a lot of common themes, but there are also some things that might be unique to and reflective of local circumstances as well. So the need to hold reserves and the type of reserves held is not exclusively down to external factors. There might be local factors as well. And probably for us, one of the factors which, again, I've highlighted in the report is around our Dsg deficit, which, again, is quite a cause of national debate at the moment and has been for a few years. So it's less the fact that we got a deficit, because an increasing number of councils have, but I think it's the scale of our deficit, the size of it, which is obviously a consideration for us. So from my perspective, and again, I've made it clear in the report, that's something I think we need to definitely take into consideration, notwithstanding what discussions we're currently entering into with the Department for Education as part of our participation in round 2 safety valve funding, which is what the Department for Education is offering as a funding allocation or potential funding agreement with a number of outlier authorities that are carrying significantly high Dsg deficits. So they entered into a number of agreements last year with, I think, with 5 authorities, and we're part of a cohort of authorities for round 2 discussions, which have just formally commenced and will conclude in mid-February next year. But I think that's an important consideration for us to at least have in view. There are clearly, as Chair said at the start, significant overlaps as well, I think, in terms of considerations of financial resilience and sustainability. Statutory role of the Chief Finance Officer, the statutory role of external audit, in terms of not just what Corporate Scrutiny Panel will be interested in terms of from a financial management perspective, but clearly as well Corporate Governance and Audit Committee, because they have that is a significant decision-making body in its own right for the council, and clearly there are significant overlaps in terms of the financial health of the council as well, in terms of the work that Corporate Governance and Audit Committee scrutinise, in terms not just in terms of preparation of and sign off of our annual financial statements, but you know, a good example at the moment is our external auditor is now preparing a much more detailed and rigorous assessment of our value for money, or what value for money is for us as a local authority, and that's something that's been introduced nationally for all councils from 2021 onwards. So that's a separate exercise. You'll remember that prior to 2021, auditors were expected to do quite a superficial review of our value for money assessment of councils, but that was a formal part of our annual sign-off of accounts process. And I think the view was sectorally, and the view from auditors as well, and the national regulator, the Financial Reporting Council, who regulates the work of auditors, that it wasn't rigorous enough, particularly in light of emerging sustainability and resilience issues. So they're in the throes of doing a value for money assessment, and that will come back initially to Corporate Governance and Audit Committee to report on, which I think will be probably January or February time. I think that they're supposed to do it within 3 months of signing off the accounts, and they've already put a marker down to Corporate Governance and Audit Committee that they will be taking not exclusive, but particular interest, given the significance of our Dsg deficit position, in terms of their review of our overall sort of value for money position, including our resilience and sustainability and reserves levels. So that's just worth bearing in mind as well. And also this, as with all scrutiny conversations, this is equally a scrutiny conversation, and there may well be some issues or recommendations or things arising from today's discussion that us as officers can go away and think about in the spirit of continuous improvement. In terms of, it might be the way that we present reserves. Is there a better way of presenting reserves to make them more understandable? For example, the way we presented them for today's conversation. Is that something you'd like to see going forward, or any other issues or or pointers or handy tips, really, we'll take them on board as well from today's discussion. So I'm going to stop at this point now that I've sort of set the scene, hopefully, and clearly, hopefully you'll have all had time to have a read of the report and just really open it up for conversation, discussion, questions, etc. I've got James and Sarah from the officers' side as well, helping me with this morning's conversation. So if I refer over to other colleagues for certain parts of the conversation, then that's it's just bringing them in to help, really, particularly if you've got some more detailed questions. But more generally, I think it's useful to have a number of officers who have been involved in this as well, because it's such a broad topic. So James and Sarah can help out as well if needs be. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so over to members. Who's first to ask a question? Councillor Munro.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Eamon, for that presentation and the report. It was really, really interesting. I've just picked up on something that's in the report from Grant Thornton, where the paragraph on financial and commercial decisions being made without sufficient transparency and consultation. I just wondered, this brings to mind the blueprint. It also brings to mind the closure of Almondbury Community School senior school and the expansion of St James's, where I feel that in both those instances there's been a lack of transparency, a lack of involvement of members in the decisions that, particularly the decisions that are being made in financial decisions. Are you doing anything in relation to that to address those points? That's all. Thank you.
Okay, Eamon.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Councillor Munro, for those comments. I think there's just reflecting back in terms of the generality of the Grant Thornton lessons learned report. I think some of the reflections they made around commercial investment decisions were probably targeted at some of those councils that effectively got into financial difficulty exacerbated by COVID in terms of the economic downturn, where they'd heavily invested in commercial activity to make a return back into to support their bottom line in terms of an income return to balance their budgets. And I think it's in the public domain. So if I mention one or two names, and some of those names might not even be in the public interest report because it was done in March, and some councils have come forward since. So I think certainly places like Croydon and Slough have made significant multi-100 million pounds investments in town centre developments and other associated party or commercial operations, specifically to make a return on that investment, and had factored in that the additional borrowing costs from those investments could be covered by the income or part of the income to make a return on, and then the rest of the income would support the council's bottom line. So that's kind of probably a scale which is significantly higher than a lot of authorities have invested to make a commercial return. So what they're basically saying is that a lot of those investment decisions early on, in terms of the business case justification and the scale of income returns that they might that they were expected to make, were grossly inflated through and weren't effectively challenged within their councils, even if they might have gone through whatever scrutiny role or committee process or executive process. There wasn't enough in an internal challenge. And I think with one council, I think Grant Thornton or the inspectors that went in, government appointed inspectors, referred to it as a kind of almost cultural corporate blindness amongst officers and councillors, that actually, are you absolutely sure that this level of return is going to be made? So sometimes it's not about the fact that there is scrutiny or there is alleged transparency. It's sometimes the fact that there isn't the right level, or for whatever reason, it's in the public domain or but just not being challenged. And sometimes it's also maybe the level of presentation, how the case is presented as well within those respective councils. So I would say that that's quite a significant scale up. I mean, you mentioned about the blueprint, for example. Fundamentally, that's not. I mean, the blueprint is quite for the council is obviously a significant regeneration investment, and that's a long-term investment. And we've been quite clear, I think, from the outset that will impact on the council's treasury management function if it goes ahead to the scale that was mooted in the report that's been taken to cabinet, because we're looking at anything up to sort of 200 and 210 million pounds as a headline for example for the cultural quarter element. So we're not assuming that development will make a commercial return that will support the borrowing costs. We're being absolutely clear that actually, if there is a bit of a commercial return in and amongst what is broadly a regeneration development, then that would broadly go back into supporting some of the operational costs of delivering what that cultural function will need to operate it going forward. In 3-4 years' time. So we are being, I think, as a council, prudent in that respect, that we're not assuming significant commercial income returns to support the entirety of the borrowing cost ask. That is something that will be a bottom line council ask. But if it's a key priority of the council going forward, then that's something that we'll have to manage within our budget going forward. And I hope the report's made that quite clear from the outset. And there has been, I think, some scrutiny through one of the panels around some of that early thinking around the blueprint, and that's going to consistently come back in and be subject to more challenge. I think the issue of Almonbury probably don't have the same level of detail in terms of the specifics, but I do know that there have been reports that have gone to cabinet, and some of those reports, appreciate, had private sections because of commercial confidentiality. But I think it has been set out in those reports around some of the financial impacts and issues around the Almonbury situation and the King James situation, and that will continue to be reviewed and assessed as we go forward. And now, I don't know whether you might have a different view on that, but I do know that those reports have been through, because we have, in terms of finance support to those reports as well, we have had a look at and scrutinised and reviewed some of the core financial issues that have been highlighted. And clearly we need to log some of those going forward, because they'll be part of the assessment in terms of the new special schools that are going to come on stream, because one of the sites at Almonbury has been identified as one of the 2 sites to support those special school developments. And clearly there are existing issues around some of the PFI contracts, etc., and some of the other site facilities on there that need to be addressed as part of that. So that also came through as part of the district schools development. I suppose the general point you're making is about transparency and challenging our authority, but as these things come forward and making sure that we are making information available as much as it can be in the right forums at the right times to be properly scrutinised and challenged, considering the scale of some of these developments. So I'd like to think that if we would be doing through scrutiny process, through relevant reports, etc. But clearly yourselves will have a view of that as well, and we'll want to feed those back in if you've got any concerns or issues that things maybe aren't as transparent as they might be.
Okay. Before I bring Philip, just to comment on that. I accept 100% what you said about commercialisation, and so things like the purchase of the piazza, it's not to make money, it's to knock it down, and so we understand what that's about. In terms of transparency with the Huddersfield Blueprint, it's for difficult, I think. In fact, it is difficult because the George Hotel position, we learnt by accident at full council meeting through the words of Brady that there was a rugby league museum was going to be sited in the library. And that was a surprise to many of us, certainly a surprise to me. And so in terms of transparency of decision making and where capital is going, that was a surprise. The fact that the George Hotel was not going to be the site for the Rugby League Museum, nowhere has any member outside the cabinet seen what the financial justification for that was. And the problem with that is that it puts members in an oppositional position. It puts us in a position where we have to question those decisions without the full information, and we just left to trust that the right decisions are being made with no access to papers. So it's incredibly unsatisfactory with regard to the biggest capital project that this council's undertaking. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Eamon, or that's just me making a statement. If you want to regard it as me making a statement, we'll move on.
I suppose the only comment I'd make from an officer perspective is there has to be in all of these conversations, there has to be a formal process to make a decision, doesn't there, ultimately? So while what you're talking about is, I suppose, discussions that are ongoing, these discussions would have to be formally ratified at some point.
Yep, agreed. We'll stop now. Over to Philip.
Thank you, Chair. There's 2 points there for Eamon. Sorry. One is that I'm still concerned about this DSG overspend. Now, the statutory instrument, you say you have to put that into unusable reserves, which is fair enough. It gives you an indication of how big an issue it is. But you're projecting 35 million at the end of this year. But I'm not confident that we're going to get much government support from in the medium long-term future on this. So is it something you'd have to reorganise the finances for in terms of how you fund that? That's my first question. And the other question is, I didn't take a great note of the autumn statement, but I understood there was an issue about reducing the business rates for, was it hospitality industry, which is quite an important part of the sort of town centres anyway. And has that been factored into your sort of reserves in that respect?
Right. Okay, thank you, Philip. Yeah, two real big ticket issues there, and thanks for raising those. Yeah, I mean the DSG deficit issue. That's I was going to say it's a really interesting one, but it's a really challenging one for us as a council as well. Don't want to delve too back into the history of it, because we are where we are with it, but as you'll know, we have reported extensively in successive recent budget rounds about the fact that DSG deficit for us has been emerging. We've also put it in the context of what's been happening nationally in terms of pressure on the high needs block of the school's funding allocation. That we're not unique, but we are one of the councils that's carrying one of the most significant deficits at the moment. So we, as I said at the start in the introduction, we've just commenced what's called a round 2 discussion with the Department for Education. So it's council officers leading on that discussion. We previously, well, clearly they've logged that we've got quite a significant deficit. So to use my sort of more colloquial parlance, they're kind of picking on the outliers. I think what's happened is that HM Treasury has set aside a funding pot nationally to effectively sort the outliers out. So they've had a series of round 1 discussions last year and a series of round 2 discussions this year. I think DFE, HM Treasury, and our own Department for Levelling Up and Communities acknowledges that there are some significant systemic challenges nationally around this whole agenda. And government are currently in the throes of a national review of special educational needs and disabilities. And there might be something that will come back later in 2022 on that, which may or may not in itself result in some changes, either statutory changes or changes in process. We don't know yet. We'll wait and see what comes back. But we are where we are at the moment with it, and we've previously as a council, as officers, pulled together a management plan, because the Educational Skills and Funding Agency, which is an arm of the DFE, have been having conversations with us, kind of warming us up to the fact that we were likely to be included in the round 2 participation conversations. So we have been pulling together quite an extensive draft management plan, which we'll be sharing with the Department for Education as part of this round 2 discussion. So we've got an introductory meeting this Thursday, and there are other conversations going on, but ultimately the aim of the conversation is to come to a funding agreement, provisional funding agreement, by mid-February next year. And the way that funding agreement is meant to work is that we need to convince the Department for Education that we're making sufficient, well, over a period of maybe 4 years, up to 4 years, this year plus another 4 years, up to 4 years, we will start to make significant inroads into the in-year deficit position. So if they can be convinced that by the end of 4 or 5 years we will have delivered a balanced in-year position, our cumulative position, which is currently 25 million, projected to be at least 35 million by this year end, and probably projected to increase further while we get to an in-year balance position, DFE will then go to HM Treasury and have separate discussions to negotiate what our allocation of that funding pot might be to effectively write down our historic deficit. So that's what's happened with the round 1, the 5 councils involved in the round 1 discussions. What we don't know, is whether or not government will sign up to that in the first place, because whatever we submit by next February has to be signed off by the relevant Secretary of State. So I think there were 6 authorities involved in the round 1 discussions last year for this safety valve funding, but 5 out of the 6 got a funding agreement, and that funding agreement was anywhere between 30 million for one particular authority and 10 million at the other end. But they're not going to give it us all up front either. There'll be a set of milestones and targets we have to deliver, so we'll get a little bit on account, and then they will release some of the remaining funding over the next 4 or 5 years, depending whether or not we're making those inroads into delivering the in-year balanced budget position. So it's quite a tricky set of discussions at the moment. We don't know what the national funding pot is that they've got to play with anyway, how limited it is and how much they're prepared to support us. So they'll be challenging us as a council quite hard in terms of what we're prepared to bring to the table in terms of our own funding, notwithstanding that in a strict technical accounting sense, as I set out in the report, the Dsg deficits are now being treated technically as unusable reserves. So they're sat on a part of our balance sheet that's completely separate in theory from consideration of use of our available cashable reserves to offset that deficit. It's almost buying them time. It's buying the DFE time by parking it that way. But that's kind of where we're at with it. And to me, as a Chief Finance Officer, I still think we got to have in view that deficit in terms of our cashable reserves position, because A, we don't know if the Secretary of State's going to sign a funding agreement, B, we don't know how much it is, and C, DFE have already told us as part of these negotiations they may expect a funding contribution from us, however that might be determined. It could partly be around some of the pump primary investment we're putting in around our special educational needs and disabilities transformation agenda. It could be something else. They might expect us to set aside some of our existing reserves as part of our own funding contribution. We just don't know at the moment. One thing we will be highlighting strongly with them, and we've said it in previous budget rounds, and we don't know whether or not, or to what extent they'll take a note of this, is when there was a national fair funding review of the schools funding formula in 2018-19 that reset baselines, and as part of that reset, our 2018-19 baseline, Kirklees, in terms of high needs funding allocation, increased by 20.9%, which was the second highest increase nationally across the 151 councils that have statutory education responsibilities. So in theory, we would have been entitled straight away to a 7 million uplift in our high needs funding allocation contribution from 18-19 onwards. But because of transitional arrangements and because government wanted to protect those authorities that might have had money taken away from them to redistribute within the system, we've effectively just had an increase in terms of 1 million increments every year since. So we haven't had the full 7 million funding up front. We've had it dribbled out in 1 million increments. And I think that's obviously been a contributory factor as well to the scale of our in-year deficit position. So we are modelling a number of scenarios back to the DFE as part of our conversation, introductory conversation this Thursday, and we have highlighted it previously to them. I don't know how much traction that's got with HM Treasury ultimately as to how much extra they may and may not be prepared to give us because of that situation. The only reason I highlight that as well is because if you look at the 5 funding agreements for the local authorities that signed up to it thus far from last year, they were in nowhere near that same position because their high needs funding allocations increased marginally on the back of the National Fair Funding Review, whereas ours increased by 20%. I think it's only Nottingham City Councils whose allocation was higher than ours at 23%. So there are things we need to challenge back to them.
Thank you for that. That's a very comprehensive answer. There's just looking at the 5-year, as it were, rollout, because it's going to take time before they give you a decision on your funding on that. But the demographic pressures are they likely to increase that pressure, or might it ease off?
That's a really difficult one to answer. I mean, we're not.
I don't expect an answer now, but it's
no.
But it's in your mind.
it certainly is, because with a model, we're having to predict or forward project what additional funding allocations more generally might go into the school system from 22-23 onwards. So, for example, you referred to the comprehensive spending review in October. There was an announcement of injection of an extra 4.7 billion into the school system over the next 3 years. So that includes, I think, 1.6 billion nationally into the 22-23 system, which has already had an increase. So ministers have been hinting that there's quite significant uplift in the high needs funding allocation across the system nationally. So we'll need to see what that means for us as well in terms of contributing to reducing the deficit. I mean, there's clearly things that we're looking at in terms of broader system review of how we go about the assessment process and what wraparound services we have, particularly around early intervention prevention, to keep more of the children in a mainstream school setting as well, and appropriately funded, because it's still less expensive than some of the alternatives where we can. I think the other, I suppose, known unknown is, but it's something that's coming back strongly from the school system about not just about the educational attainment issues with COVID impact. I think it's been said nationally that it's put some school kids back a whole generation in terms of attainment, but also the behavioural impact. And it's not mutually exclusive, but the relative isolation, and particularly around, but not exclusively around, early years development, children coming into the system, sort of reception, that kind of age range, and for those children that might already have been considered for an education, health and care plan, whether or not some of the issues around COVID isolation, etc., have actually exacerbated some of those issues, resulting in more complex cases starting to come through earlier, or cases that might otherwise have been appropriately managed are actually putting more pressure on the system. And that's not just around special educational needs and disabilities, that's around children more generally, and also, in terms of vulnerable adults coming through the system as well. So there's a more general thing about the long-term or medium to longer term impacts of COVID, whether that's starting to come through. But it's kind of early days, but the indications are that it is starting to be a pressure, but we need to understand more about what it means nationally as well. Sorry, you made another point about
the other point was
business
about
rates.
The business rate. There was discussion, I think, in the autumn statement about business rates being reduced for the hospitality industry. Did I get that correctly? In which case, that would have an impact on our sort of local revenue from business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just in terms of that, so yeah, you're right. Government have indicated that they're going to continue with some of the targeted interventions that they've made in this year and last year to support certain sectors, as you've just identified. So I think it's 50% business rates relief for a number of sectors. We would get compensating grant as a council for that loss, so it shouldn't in theory impact on our bottom line. We would get a relevant amount of compensation for that.
I wasn't aware of that being made clear.
No, that's okay. They've also frozen the business rates uplift for 22-23 as well. To support businesses, and again, councils would get compensation for the freezing of the uplift, because we would normally have assumed that that would just be added onto the business rates bill to support councils' bottom lines. Again, this will all come out in the wash when we get the settlement details in terms of what it means at an individual local authority level. And you'll have picked up nationally as well that with the Omicron situation, some of this is quite fluid as well, whether or not government might be inclined to put in some short-term measures for depending what happens around in terms of sort of national measures to deal with infection rates going forward. And they certainly did that through last year as well, where they dropped in quite a significant number of support grants to businesses through the year. So we'll need to keep an eye on that, but it may or may not happen in addition to what's already been announced in the spending review.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for the very comprehensive answers. I think that's probably about half an hour of Philip there. Okay, Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Eamon. Number of points to comment on, really. The first one is it's a bit unfortunate, and perhaps feedback if you can, that we haven't got the cabinet member present.
But I think he's given his apologies, and I'm aware that the cabinet member has got some issues, personal issues at the moment that needs attending to. So I think I'm more than happy to accept his apologies for this matter.
Right, because I think we're going to have this discussion, but we could do with somebody from the administration present to be able to listen to what's being said and actually then to pick up some of the issues and concerns that we're raising. Because my second point, in support of what Councillor Munro was saying earlier around transparency and detail, I can't really comment on the school, but in terms of the cultural heart, I was part of the scrutiny panel that came to. But unfortunately, Eamon, they bring it to scrutiny at such an early stage. There is no detail involved. We haven't really had very much to scrutinise. I have fed that back already, but we're actually being asked to take on trust, really, what the administration is wanting to do. And as I've made in a number of meetings, comments I've made in a number of meetings now, the analogy for me is a maths exam. In a maths exam, it's no good coming out with the answer. You have to show your workings out. And I'm afraid the administration haven't been showing the workings out on a lot of this. And, it's very, very difficult for us to go, yes, we'll take that as the right approach or the right way forward, because so much information is not shared with anyone. It's very, very difficult for us as opposition members or as members of the scrutiny panel to actually form a view because we have no information in sight. So again, I think if we are going to, as we move forward on a journey around the regeneration plans, there's a strong pushback to say more information needs to be shared and those working outs need to be shown, because otherwise it's asking an awful lot to take on the trust of the administration. And, I'm not going to make any political points about it, but, some people have been unhappy with some decisions that have been taken in the past, and, I've made those. No, I'm looking at Andrew, and I made those points quite firmly. I'll leave it at that. On the school deficit, we have talked about this a number of times through both scrutiny and corporate governance and audit, and probably in other places as well. My question is, was the council late at recognising it needed to do some transformational activities here. If that work had started early, would we be in a better position financially? Because I know there is a plan to try and get us into a position where, as you were saying slightly earlier, Eamon, where our in-year deficit is hopefully brought under control. And a lot of that is about the transformation programme within children's services. Is it because that started late that we're perhaps in a worse position than we might have been? Because as you say, since 2017-18, we've been aware of the pressure that's in place and that it's been growing each year. So possibly there's a recognition there that if we'd have tackled it earlier, we wouldn't have solved the problem by any means, but we might be a little further down the path in terms of getting through that transformational work. And then two other things. One, again, it links a bit back to transparency, Eamon, but I always struggle with the reserves because I see the numbers and I see the headlines and I don't understand what the headline means. So when I read a line that says inclusive investment or strategic investment support, and it's got a large number behind it, I have no idea what that means. And there doesn't seem to be anything anywhere where I could link through and then have a better understanding of what that means. And often when the reserves are presented at a higher level, you present them on the themes, the eight outcomes, and I never really understand what that then means that reserve relates to. So I think there's something about using simple language that, you know, for me, education is education. So if it's about education, it should say education, you know, not early years or early start or whatever the outcome terminology is. Because I think if I struggle with it and I'm involved in all this stuff, what's the general public going to look at and what understanding are they going to have? So I think there's something there about how easy we make it for people to read and understand the information that we provide. And I'll leave it at that. And then my final point, and I know we've debated this a number of times, I'm still no clearer, is that in last year's budget, well, not last year's budget, in the budget for 2019-20, yeah, no, 20, I was going to be years muddled up, 2021, the last full year that finished, 2021, isn't it? We set out a budget that identified what our spending plans were and how we were going to balance that budget in terms of what income we would have, what expectations we would have in terms of council tax revenue and various other grants, etc. That year was then turned on its head as a result of COVID. And all of the reports I've seen is that we have identified what our additional costs were as a result of COVID and what the loss of income was as a result of COVID, and that largely the money provided in various ways in chunks and grants and various other things from the government have met those additional costs. And that means that in all things being equal, everything should still be in balance. But of course, we didn't provide a lot of services during 2020-21 because things were closed and we had to stop doing various things because of the various national regulations. In my head, that should have left with a reserve of an underspend, but I can never see where that underspend is. And it must have happened because we weren't able to do things. And that's the bit I struggle with, really struggle with, is where did that money go? And I'll leave it at that, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Eamon, any reflections on that? Is there a big pot of cash you haven't thought about somewhere, which is an underspend?
Just trying to work out which bits to respond to and which bits were statements. But I'll have a go. So you first noted on the blueprint, the blueprint issue. I think that's feedback back into the organisation, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think I'm taking that for future reference. On the DSG deficit issue, could we have tackled it earlier? think that's quite a difficult one to answer, I think, to be honest, certainly from my perspective, but it's something that, you know, you could probably best asking the service, to be honest, in terms of their understanding. From a financial point of view, we were aware that there was a deficit in 17-18 because we declared it, we noted it, and then that deficit increased in 18-19 as well. But what we did for those 2 financial years at the time, when we could use general fund reserves without having to have a Secretary of State permission, which is where we're at now, on an exceptions basis, because of the way that we're now describing the DSG deficit as an unusable reserve. We effectively wrote down those deficits in those 2 years, but the underlying situation was still there, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The difference between the funding allocation and the underlying drivers that were driving the costs were still there and starting to build up and build up and build up. And I suppose at the time, when it was starting to bubble up nationally, probably around about the same time, but certainly not to the level of sort of I suppose, national sectoral noise that there is now, because a number of probably is what's happened is that a number of authorities, and we did this even prior to 17-18, may have used some of our other contingencies where we got some flexibilities around our overall DSG funding allocation, legitimately just sort of to team and ladle at the margins, but actually the underlying issue is starting to come through. So I think my only observation at the time as well, and you know, you can't necessarily use this as an excuse, but you'll appreciate on the back of the children's Ofsted inspection as well, we're still heavily in the throes of turning around children and child protection part of the organisation, and you know, whether to what extent capacity was being put into that area, and as a result of that, that may or may not have had implications in terms of trying to address 2 significant issues at the same time. I don't know.
That's my point, really, Eamon. I don't think this isn't about a blame game, is it? It's about going, yeah, probably we should have tackled it earlier. But for me, it's more, do we take those learnings away? So if we find another area of the budget where things are starting to grow, we've got the flags in place to pick that up earlier, isn't it? And then feed it back into the service so that there's something in place to tackle it.
No, I'd absolutely agree, and that's one of the points that consistently comes through from the public interest reports, etc., nationally about, you know, where were the early radars with some of this? You know, why wait till your cashable reserves are about to run out before you press the crisis management button when it's far too late? When actually sometimes it's what's the expression, hiding in plain sight, isn't it? That it's obvious what's going on, but going back to the what Grant Thornton said about one authority about corporate blindness, it might be in front of your eyes, but you don't want to see it because you're trying to convince yourself that you've got a solution to address your bottom line that doesn't require some difficult choices or as difficult choices, which is where a number of authorities went around commercial investments. And, you know, to be fair, it was encouraged as well, but 1 or 2, I think, have done it in a way that's probably tainted the sector a little bit. And now, as we know, government's trying to hold back a little bit.
Okay. Thanks for that. Kath, Councillor Pinnock.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, just a comment on the SEND stuff, and then a question. It's not surprising if, as government did, remove the early intervention and prevention funding, that you end up with an increasing numbers of children who need more expensive and more long-term help, which could have been prevented by using funding earlier. And that's not me, that's a report from Parliament, a parliamentary select committee. So that's where the problem has laid, and that's true of a number of other issues, financial issues that councils and our council face. Right, next, the other point I want to make, Eamon, as you know, I have for a long time worried about the use of the term reserves, because what some councillors see, and certainly what the general public see, is a headline figure saying 182, I think it is, whatever it is, £1 million left in the kitty, and services are still being cut. Of course, that's not a sustainable argument, but that's what is seen, because people look at a headline figure, look at the title, think that reserves equals the nest egg for the rainy day. Here's the rainy day, and we're not using the nest egg, because that's how it's viewed. So I would really urge us, if it is possible, in the the world of financial terminology, to try and change that word, or if you have to, use it as the headline word, and then define it separately, because I've obviously done loads of council budgets over my time as councillor, and almost every year an opposition budget, probably a Lib Dem one as well, so this is not a political point, says, oh, we can take these money from reserves and use that to bolster some service issues. So what we need from finance is a much more detailed definition of each of those, and whether any of them are absolutely watertight in the sums that are within that funding package as a reserve, and which ones can and cannot be used, because we are going to face further financial pressures because of government funding for the next few years, and we just need to know where funding lies that can be used. But none of us want to be in the position of trying to explain to people who question why there's 180 million in there and we still got potholes, for example, because that's how, understandably, sometimes the level of debate. So there you are, challenge for you, Eamon.
Okay, Eamon, do you want to call it something else? What would you call it?
Well, we'll work on it. I take your point, and to some extent, I think it ties in with Councillor Taylor's earlier comment about being clearer about what the reserves, or the headline reserves. What actually are those categories of funds that we've got, one-off funds we've got set aside? What is their purpose? What are they there for? What have we got flexibility with? What haven't we got flexibility with? And to explain why we have or haven't, to give you and the public a better understanding and at least appreciation of why we're holding reserves for those purposes, and the levels of reserves at particular points in time. So yeah, I totally get that. We'll put our thinking caps on, but we're not, as you'll know, we haven't got exclusive rights in terms of our I suppose ideas either. So if there's good practice out there or things that colleagues have come across from reading other reports, and we'll have a look at those as well, that can help us, we'll do that. But yeah, it's a fair challenge. I think it's something we'll take away.
One of the things,
I mean, sorry, Andrew. The key thing surely is also understanding where there's flexibility.
Yeah.
Because none of there's some of them quite substantial sums of money within earmarked reserves, and we don't know whether there is any flexibility at all in any of those, or whether for some it is a a balanced judgment by yourselves and the finance team as to how much needs to be in there, and you know, whether that's being overly prudent or whether we, you know, the council could use some of the funding for other things. It's that really, because unless we do that, as there are increasing pressures on council budgets, there will be increasing spotlight on the so-called reserves, and unless there's clarity about those, then we as councillors will not be able to answer the questions as to why we're not using that for, to say, for example, to fix potholes.
Okay. One of the things I've mentioned in an earlier meeting we had, Eamon, was about examples of purposes that reserves are used for. One example I can provide is the Hunters Waste site, where £1 million clear up, we understand, of a major illegal dump had to be tackled by the council. You know, nobody else would do it. We are the agency of last resort, and so examples that we can provide which show how unforeseen maybe to an extent, things do come forward. So having those examples to hand is useful for us when we're sort of raising the issue with members of the public, but also with councillors as well. And I think we've got to call out amendments if they're somehow allowed, which have undue emphasis on one-off reserves to put off the rainy day, which will still come, and probably be even rainier if we do use reserves properly. Just a quick question, Philip. Is your hand up as a result of? Is that a new hand? You're muted.
I've taken it down. Sorry, I didn't take it down. I hadn't seen the yellow, but yeah.
Okay. So at the moment, nobody wants to say anything. Is that right?
Well, I will say something now.
You didn't get your hand up.
I've just put it up again. I think, first of all, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, the comment about the extent of reserves and things. Obviously, about 74 million of those reserves at the moment are very much earmarked. One is the statutory requirement for the Dsg grant, and the other thing is the rollover of the COVID funding, which would specifically for COVID work. But working on the basis of between a 5 and 10% as recommended by the auditors as such, it would be probably, you wouldn't want to go down to the 5%, which I think so far the management of these things, it might not be stated in a way that's friendly to the public, but it's been pretty well done from my point of view.
Okay. Councillor Homewood.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick comment and question. So I fully agree with what other members said about the clarity on what reserves are and the understandability of that. I think, you know, we've got to bear in mind as well that most people don't understand, you know, that their understanding of local government finance is going to be limited, even in terms of the vault, you know, the amount of money that's spent in Kirklees and the size of Kirklees as a authority. I think you know, people just wouldn't have that context. So I think how we can explain that is very useful. The other question I just wanted to ask is just about the SIPFA thing, just because I've seen that used quite a few times in different reports. And I just wanted to understand, you know, when we're looking at this and it's kind of telling you your kind of indicator, financial stresses, etc., is that literally just a comparison, or is it taking into consideration specific things in that authority? Because I know you mentioned, for example, you know, although there'll be some similarities between authorities of similar size, there'll be certain risks in different authorities. And so how do we know that the authority that's got the largest reserves, is that because they've got a specific risk that is kind of not relevant to us, for example, or vice versa at the bottom end? So is it just a comparison, or is it more than that? And if it's just a comparison, how actually useful is it as a tool?
Okay, Eamon?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Homewood. That's a really good point. You're right. We have used it in previous conversations with corporate scrutiny panel, and we've put it some of the headline indicators into our corporate member reports as well. You know, budget council, etc. I think it's quite a general indicator. It's not overly sophisticated in that regard. You have to draw your own conclusions as to why some councils might hold the level of reserves that they do, because what the indicator does, as you know, it looks at reserves, usable reserves, cashable reserves, as a proportion of the general fund's net revenue budget. So for us, if for argument's sake, say it's around about 300 million. So if our reserves level is whatever, as it was at the start of the year, and it say around about, it's about 160 million, or was it 180 million? I have to get the report back up, but whatever it was at the time that it was measured by SITFA, it comes up with an indicator for us, which is just under 40%. It excludes school balances and public health reserves because they're statutorily ring fenced, so we can't dip into them regardless and use them for other things. So it's as general as that. I suppose what all the indicators do in terms of the SITFA Resilience Index, they're there to promote, I suppose, key lines of inquiry and further conversations about why some councils hold reserves that are a much higher proportion and some hold reserves that are a much lower proportion. And I think we've said, certainly for the last couple of years, that we're round about in the middle. Now, whether that reflects safety in numbers, that, you know, it's like Goldilocks, isn't it? Not too hot, not too cold. Is being in the middle a reason? Well, I won't say comfortable place, but you know, does that give you assurance that we're not holding on too much reserves, but equally we're not holding on too little reserves? Because if you actually went on a local authority by local authority basis, for example, when we do the METs comparison, which is the comparison we've got in here, I think the lowest MET was 16% in terms of percentage figure, and the highest MET was 80-odd%, and we're kind of slap bang in the middle at 39%. So it's in the public domain. So it's Rochdale councils that got 83%. But like you say, are there some specific reasons why Rochdale are holding that 83%? They may have decided to hold a proportion of reserves, maybe for some specific council ambition development, for example, you know, in terms of a major pump prime. Or they may have some specific local risks that we're not aware of that are particular to their particular circumstance, where they can justify holding that level of reserve at that time. I suppose when you get to the other end of the scale, that does kind of suggest that, particularly with the larger councils, the city councils, so you look at your Leeds and Liverpools of this world, that I think historically have held relatively low balances for whatever reason. And then when you're getting now to those kind of levels, and given the scale and size of those authorities, then that's do you look at the larger authorities and the city the big city councils in a slightly different context in their own right? Why are they holding historically lower level of reserves? Is it a factor of their funding allocations? Is it a factor of the fact that they're pushing the envelope more in terms of commercial and other investment? You know, what are the contributory factors there? I think feedback we've had, certainly through previous corporate scrutiny panels, has been that actually being in the middle of the pack hasn't felt uncomfortable for us, but reserves levels have to always be reviewed as to the appropriateness of and why they're necessary, and as you clearly fed back as well, having a clear explanation for what the rationale is for holding those reserves, to give you as councillors some parameters to work with as well in terms of explaining to the public and consideration of what flexibility you might have. So it's just a part of a suite of indicators, but I think we need to be mindful that any councillor ends up in financial difficulties fundamentally, and technically they, you know, all councils are meant to be going concerns because they're public sector bodies that statutorily have to produce balanced budgets, but where they do technically go bankrupt or near bankruptcy, they just run out of cash. So those usable reserves that you show in that graph, if we run out of cash, or even if we're looking to run out of cash, and we're not doing anything about it, we are statutorily heavily into Section 114 territory. It's as simple as that. So the councils that have had a Section 114 notice served, or near as damn it, or where they've put in local government or national government commissioners have gone in, or public interest reports have been issued, regardless of how they got to where they got to, fundamentally they're at the point of running out of cash. So if your starting point anyway on that spectrum of proportion of reserves is quite low, then there is an argument that says you're in a much more financially challenging and a more difficult financial resilience position to start with. We're not there, but clearly we've got a significant DSG deficit hanging over us as well. So when you're looking at local circumstance, the relative size of our deficit relative to our overall reserves position has to be a factor in consideration of what we may or may not want to set aside as not being flexible, and we need to keep that to one side until we've got a clear plan with the DFE, and until we're confident that our own plans will deliver a balanced budget position over time. So to me, that is the one overriding local factor, and I appreciate what Councillor Cooper's saying about exceptional issues as well, because we have also drawn down in the past for adverse, exceptional weather events, although they seem to be becoming more the norm these days, don't they? It wasn't too long ago where it was exceptional, maybe once every 4 or 5 years, but it's more the norm that we don't get an exceptional weather event these days. So they will always kind of be there with us, and we've got a corporate risk register as well that we refer to. As I said, there's a lot of commonality, but it's a question of degree in terms of the elements within our corporate risk registers, of which ones would we attach a higher weighting to as more relevant to our sort of local risks. So DSG deficit might be in there, exceptional weather might be in there because we're quite a dispersed, second, or was it sixth largest by geographical size of the 36 Mets. So I don't know, Councillor Homewood, if being middle of the pack gives you any comfort in terms of our relative position, but and I don't know how distorted it's going to be from when they update it for 2021 on the back of the COVID funding roll forward, which a lot of councils have done, but we need to see that come through as well.
I think it does. I think and I'm not suggesting that. I think as you explained in this session, there's lots of things that are factored into this. I think it's just one of those things that SIP for thing. It's quite an easy, because of when we were talking about what you understand from how things are presented, it's quite a neatly presented thing, isn't it, for someone to look at? And I think the important thing is to say that just because you flick on to Kirklees and it's middle-ish doesn't necessarily tell us that that's the right position, that's a good position or bad position. And I'm guessing it sounds to me like the biggest authorities tend to have the smaller or the smaller reserves. And I don't know whether that's because of some smaller, even though we're talking about metropolitans here, I don't know if it's because some smaller authorities, obviously those one-off issues like what Councillor Cooper was just referring to, obviously would be a bigger proportion of their reserves. So I think that's it's help. I think the thing for me is it's kind of a helpful summary, but it doesn't, if we find out tomorrow that in this year's that we're 3/4, we're not in the middle anymore, we're at the bottom, that isn't necessarily telling us that there's a problem. It might be the things you've just referred to in terms of the way that the COVID things are presenting, etc. And so we just need to be mindful of that sometimes it can look positive, sometimes it might not, but it might not materially telling us anything's significantly changed, if you like.
Okay, no, that's useful. You're absolutely right. I think context is all. I'm just picking up on. I think it was Philip's. I think did you mention earlier, Philip, about the Grant Thornton review, where it was quoting between 5 and 10%.
Correct. Yeah.
Which is kind of, it's interesting because there are auditors, aren't they? And that's the first time I've seen that quoted in that context, or any context by auditors, other than when they're quoting that reserves levels are acutely low, and by that time that's when special measures are in place for those authorities, because you're hitting the point where reserves might disappear completely. But so I mean, I have been asked quite a number of times about whether there's a prescriptive formula for what reserves levels should be, would be appropriate for different organisations. Because if you look, I think if you look in the charity sector, there are different approaches that are used in terms of advice as to what might be appropriate level of reserves. So 10%. So if we said that 10% was a minimum, I think that's in the context what General Thornton were referring to as unallocated balances, and I would include. So we've got our general balances position, which is about 10 million, and you could argue that most, if not all, of what we refer to as financial resilience reserves aren't prescribed to any part of our corporate risk register. They're just there available in terms of our budget risk. So if you added that to our general balances, that would take us up to, I think, around about 14-15%. But then if you overlay the Dsg deficit as an offset against that might kind of feel appropriate as a kind of an ultimate lesson, in terms of council resilience. Whatever we do going forward, we need to hold this level of reserves at a point in time until we feel comfortable to be able to release that if conditions, change to the point where we do feel more comfortable. So that while it is still a subjective viewpoint, the fact that our auditors have quoted in one of their, in the lessons learned report, 5 to 10% is probably something to, maybe we can reflect on that as well in terms of how we represent how we explain the types of reserves that we hold. You picked up on that. I just thought it was an interesting observation from Grant Thornton as well, because clearly when they're doing their VFM assessment as well, they might have that in the back of their minds, whether or not they bring it to the forefront.
Okay, Councillor Greaves.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for my late arrival and dipping in and out of the meeting, but my internet connections is as it is. So apologies if you've already covered this, Eamon. But whilst I agree broadly with almost everything everybody else has said, there's a couple of questions I want to ask you regarding the reserves. So I'm looking at pages 20 and 21 of Appendix, which is Appendix A. So just help me if I've understood this correctly. Where we come to the final column, revised reserves position 1st of April 2027, if that number is the same as the first column, April 2021, does that mean that there's no expectation of using that money and it's just going to be a carried forward reserve from one year to another, just in case the unexpected happens, whereas the other ones are actually planned to be consumed within that period of time?
Okay. Eamon? You're on mute.
So I'll give you an example of one, the apprenticeship levy.
Yeah. Okay, I think the point you're raising actually ties neatly into some of the early conversation as well about what the broad brush assumptions are about some of those trajectories and why we hold certain reserves, and what does that mean in terms of 5-6 years hence. So I think this trajectory was done at a point in time as part of the medium-term financial strategy update report in October. So as part of budget development, we'll be reviewing some of the trajectory assumptions with some of these reserves anyway, and clearly I think what we've got from today's discussion as well has been absolutely clear about our assumptions that we're going to put into the annual budget report around reserves as well, and make them hopefully clearer. But some of these reserves are in there. For example, the apprenticeship levy reserve, that's a good example, or fund, or whatever we call it, where we carry it through reserves because technically that's how we have to account for it, because we get the income in a certain year. But if that income in effect covers a number of years, then we use our council reserves as effectively as a mechanism for holding that funding and rolling it forward into future years. But some of these reserves, some of the headlines, some of the headings are actually, while they're not technically ring fenced in the sense that they're not school balances or public health, in terms of what we discussed earlier about our, that measure of reserves as a proportion of our general fund net budget. Some of these reserves we internally would effectively treat as ring fence, because the apprenticeship levy funds that we received, that was a mechanism that government set up a few years ago, where you had employer contributions to support that levy pot, and then that levy pot is drawn down over years. So we wouldn't use that levy funding for any other purpose, because at a point in time, if we don't utilise all that funding after however many years this apprenticeship levy continues for, then technically we might have to give that money back. So it's not necessarily a fund that we could flexibly use for another purpose, but the way that it's forecast to be used over a number of years is probably just based on kind of current trends. So going back to your fundamental point about if that 78 million in 4 or 5 years time that we're projecting, I think between now and then, this is just a snapshot at a point in time. We'll be reviewing our reserves requirement on a regular basis anyway, based on our approach to our understanding of risk, etc. So the reality is that a number of this trajectory, I think it's useful and important in the context of our medium-term financial strategy, that we look further ahead, but they're quite dynamic in reality. So we will refresh these projections on a regular basis. I think what you need to be clear about, which is coming through strongly, is even within the forward projections, which are the ones that we effectively can't be touched for various reasons, and which are the ones you've got flexibility. So even within financial resilience reserves, if some of those corporate risk register risks go away, there is an argument that actually some of that could be reinvested into other areas where you've got more flexibility. So it can be dynamic between different categories of reserve. So don't assume that 78 million is cast in stone. It's just based on a set of assumptions and estimates at a point in time to illustrate a more broader point about what is the useful quantum that we need to hold over a 3 to 5 year period, and constantly refresh it. Probably a lot of the reserves that we show at a point in time in terms of forward projections, those projections will change, and they will change for different reasons.
Oh, okay. I'm a bit perhaps a bit more confused than I was before I asked the question. With the apprenticeship levy, then, are you saying that there's no plans for the council to use any of that funding in the next 6 years, or is it a case of it'll be used each year, then refreshed each year, then used each year and refreshed each year?
Yeah, sorry, I see what you're getting at now. So while it shows at 3.191 million, and then that's rolled, that's untouched across years. I think with a number of these, they will be reviewed, because that apprenticeship levy does get refreshed and it does get drawn down as well. But yeah, I think that's one where, and there are probably some others as well in terms of what we're projecting, that we obviously will need to liaise as we do anyway with corporate colleagues who are responsible for the apprenticeship funding. And working with other partners as well, so what those forward projections might be. So we're certainly not saying that we're freezing that levy and won't use it. I suppose it's just it maybe doesn't reflect the assumptions about what's going to be added to and what's going to be drawn down. Now it could happen. Some of that drawdown could be accelerated. I think it ties in with industry and sectoral approaches to future apprentices as well, that we're all keen to develop. So if we scale those up and we get in, businesses and encourage sectors to actually use apprenticeship or use that funding to support apprenticeships, which is what it's there for, it could scale up quite significantly. So I think that's a good example where it's not quite what it might seem that we're not using it. It's just maybe we need to review those projections going forward. But again, they will change. But okay. Rest assured, we are using that funding.
Well, then, so perhaps another example would be the insurance and property and treasury smoothing. So are they very much your traditional just-in-case reserves?
I think To some extent, yes, but the just in case specific risk reserves that recognise the reality that the way that the council's insurance fund works is that there are some uninsurable risks that we're carrying. And it's just a feature of, you know, all councils will carry some element of uninsurable risk because we just in the nature of how those insurance funds operated, probably for a number of years now, we've carried forward an amount. I think it's 1.9 million as part of our overall reserves level as a reasonable level of uninsurable risk fund to carry forward, and we haven't drawn that down in recent times. But I think it's there as a kind of on an exceptional basis, and I think the head of internal audit and risk has previously commented certainly to us that he's reasonably assured, as is our key our head or our insurance lead officer who works with Martin Durnley, that it's an acceptable level of fund to carry. But again, it will be reviewed, and with the Treasury Management Smoothing one and the property reserve or loan reserve and property and other loan reserve, again, we need to make I suppose a judgment call in terms of the totality of loans that we hold on our balance sheet at any point in time with other organisations and potential level of risk of loan default, which we do review on a regular basis. And I think as well, if we're looking at things like Cultural Heart Programme, and there's some, you know, potential volatility, maybe short term, who knows, around interest rates because of the economic situation, then some of our assumptions around Treasury money management budgets that we need to hold in our medium-term financial plan, I think we've assessed that actually there might be some more in-year volatility in terms of either slippage on schemes or schemes coming forward or interest rate variability. So to have a little bit of buffer in reserve helps to smooth out some of those bumps in the road as well, as we scale up our investment programme. So we think it's probably overall an appropriate level from a professional officer perspective, appropriate level to hold. But again, we can explain, and we will explain that clearly and continue to explain that as part of our sort of future approach in terms of justification and rationale for holding those reserves. So they are specific purpose reserves held that we've identified some specific issues where you could get exceptional changes in year, but over time they kind of smooth themselves out.
Okay.
But they are very much an exception. I think there's only 3 of them that we set aside for specific risk purposes.
Okay. Well, I think perhaps picking up, I think it was Kath that said it, but I think it's a view shared by everybody.
Yeah.
Some greater clarity around whether these just exactly the nature of these reserves would be really helpful. One of my grouches, if you like, is when it comes to budget time and writing an amendment, is we're always told that there's no money, and then money somehow magically appears from nowhere out of some reserve that nobody was aware of, and sometimes it just feels a little bit like the where flexibility may exist, it perhaps isn't clear to everybody in the council that that's the case, or the degree of flexibility. But I think for now, just being a bit clearer on what the reserves are and how each individual one operates would be helpful.
Okay, Councillor Pamela Davies.
Hi, thank you. The question, I don't disagree with anything anybody else has said, and I think that the extra clarity would be welcomed in what the reserves are there for. If that sounds too blunt, but my question is, just as looking at it in some detail, as it's predicting for the next 10 years, and it starts out from where we are as of April 2021. Where's the measure of of the April 21 figures? Obviously, five years ago, 10 years ago, they'll have been on some prediction sheet somewhere. Where's the variation on that? Do the April 21 figures meet what our predictions were? That's the clarity of my question. Sorry, it struggled to get to the top, but and so have we met our previous predictions, and is there some sort of explanation on any deviation from that? Does that make sense? Is that as a question? Have we hit our previous predictions? And I think what I would like to see is some explanation as why we haven't, or why we haven't needed those reserves, or why we've exceeded those reserves. Because that, for me, is where the devil is in that detail there, whether it's to the good or to the bad, so that we can explore what we're looking at.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Davis. No, that's a really good question to raise as well, isn't it? So it's what you're saying basically is, you know, we set a budget, we set some predictions around reserves, we monitor those reserves, review the movement in reserves as part of our in-year monitoring, and then at year end we update our reserves position. You know, I think for the reasons I described earlier and set out in previous reports, I don't think anybody could have predicted where we'd be at the start of April 21 in terms of our actual reserves position, particularly around the COVID funding situation, because we going back to we set a budget, didn't we, in February 2020, and then literally 4 weeks after that we went into a national lockdown scenario, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I think a lot of the difference between April 21st and previous years is could not possibly have been predicted. We do try and, you know, obviously we look at future forecasts, etc., as we've done here. I think it's in the nature of what the reserves are there for, and what we use them for. That it's sometimes not. It's not as easy to predict with absolute certainty. That just because we set out at the start of the year what we think the forecast reserves position may be, there may be things that come through during the year that fundamentally mean that we need to change our predictions. Some are fairly steady, and some aren't, and some. I mean, what we do try to do, we do is if there is a requirement or there's a view that we need to beef up a certain reserve, or if we need to create a new reserve for whatever reason, then we would need to report that back to Cabinet, any new reserves requirement, and any significant increase or decrease in existing reserves. Again, we'd report back to Cabinet and then report to Council as well around that, as we did with the outturn report and we did with the annual budget report. I suppose what would be useful going forward, in the interests of some of the feedback that's been fed back today as well about sort of clarity, is a better understanding of some of those movements and where the justification came for some of those movements and how they differ to what we might have considered at the start of the year. So there's a kind of an audit trail for decision making around some of those things, just to make it clear as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but at least it will give you, if we can make it clear in terms of the rationale why reserves have ended up the way that they have done. If you tried to compare what we thought we were going to predict at the start of the year, you know, why is it so different? Then that might help as well, make it more explicit in the narrative as a bit of an audit trail.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's exactly what I was looking for.
Okay.
Thanks, Eamon.
Yeah, we'll certainly pick that up.
Okay, Councillor Munro.
Thank you. Mine's just that my question just is following on really from that one of 12 Greaves, in terms of clarification again. It's trying to understand dual PFI. We don't appear to be carrying that reserve forward post 2021. So I just wondered what's the rationale for that, and what would come under other? What kind of things go under other? If you could just explain those, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Munro. We've probably, to be honest, on the PFI affordability one, we probably explained that. We certainly did touch on it in the annual budget report in February, but probably did more of a detailed explanation, to be honest, in the schools funding report that goes in January as well. because it related fundamentally to a double count in the in the schools funding allocation from government to ourselves, where I think prior to 1920 we had to set aside an amount within our general fund budget to contribute towards some of the funding to PFI affordability costs for schools. But then, and that I think that was from 2013 onwards. So it was a fairly set amount in our annual budget. And then, for various reasons, government decided to absorb those costs, because we weren't the only council that were having to absorb certain PFI schools related costs. They decided to build that into the schools funding allocation, I think through the premises element of that funding allocation, but they did it in such a general way. It wasn't explicit with the funding that was announced for 1920 that they'd done that. So we continue to contribute towards schools funding through our own general fund allocation, as we had done in previous years, but schools had also actually got that funding transferred to them through their funding allocation. So once we'd spotted the error and reported that back to Budget Council and Cabinet as well, and to had a conversation with the Department for Education about it, what we agreed was that we would, because we had that funding in our base budget, we'd set aside through our base budget allocation, transfer an amount over 2 years into our reserve. And then rather than claw it back from schools over the 2 years, that we would effectively draw down our reserves while we adjusted the school's funding allocation position. So we basically said to them, look, you've got your funding allocation, that covers your PFI costs going forward. So we're going to have to claw back from your funding allocations the amounts that we would have contributed on top of that, because of the school's affordability issue that hitherto we paid for out of general fund and contributed towards your budget lines. So it's kind of a 2-year agreement where we'd effectively draw down that reserve to buffer the schools from clawing it back from them over 2 years, just to give them some extra time to account for the fact, or to plan for the fact that we would no longer be giving them that extra allocation because they already had it. So it's just a double count issue. That's why it disappears in 21-22. I appreciate I haven't explained it very well. It's actually better explaining some of our reports and off the top of my head, but that's effectively why it disappears after 21-22. It's just to resolve a short-term issue, then everything sort of balances out going forward. So again, that's kind of a good example where we've got a reserve in there for a specific purpose, for a short limited, with a limited time span, and then it will go.
Yeah. Okay. And just with regards to other, what do you classify as other? What comes under? What constitutes other? What type of things constitute other? Because that's quite a significant amount.
Yeah. Again, I suppose what we've done is we've added together a number of smaller reserves, which I think individually are 500,000 or less for specific, and some of that it probably covers some of what we described earlier around smoothing adjustments. So there's 500,000 in there for elections, which we did show separately at one point in time. And the reason that exists is just because sometimes if there's a local election called, which is out of the norm, and there's additional costs incurred, which are above and beyond what government allocates or gives to councils to support specific elections, and it could be a by-election or something else, that in the past elections have struggled to cover some of those additional costs. So it's just there as a smoothing reserve, as it were, just to cover exceptional cases where there may be, for whatever reason, local elections called at a specific time of the year above and beyond the normal municipal cycle. But again, what we can do is, break that down into more detail so you can see exactly what some of the other smaller funding allocations are as well. I suppose it's sometimes from our point of view as officers is how much detail how much detail do you want in the headline reports that sits behind some of these headline allocations? But, you know, quite happy to break them down into more detail.
Yeah, that helps. It just helps to understand then.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
It helps to understand a lot more why we're carrying it. That's
Yeah.
great. Thank you very much, Amy. You
Okay.
explained that really well. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You're on mute, Councillor Cooper.
There I am, talking away. Thank you, Eamon, for the marathon session, answering members' questions. That's much appreciated. We'll close the session, that session now, just to note the work programme going forward. If members have any items that they wish to raise on the work programme, please do get in touch with me and I will look at that. Anything more before we close the meeting? Okay, gone. Thanks very much, everybody. I'll see you later. Bye.